Didn't you say that while you were in the service, you went to Australia once or something like that?
No. My only visits to Australia have been with my Oculus Rift.
With your what?
My Oculus Rift.
3D goggles.
I'm like, what?
I'm very fond of my Oculus Rift. I put it on my head, and I'm wherever it takes me. I mean, I could go wherever I want. They're cool. They'll be YouTube. Is it YouTube? No, Facebook bought Oculus. They look like this. Go to my blog. This one there, but I don't own stock as far as I know in them or anything, so. But I highly recommend them if you have the opportunity. No show, but there's ads, so you can see what they look like. But they make it look like you're there. So I have a camera that I use to take pictures of. That's the whole thing. Pretty cool stuff. But, so last class, my quiz question was, if Jesus comes to your door, right? And he asks you to sell everything, give the money to the poor, and come follow him, right?
I am the poor.
Very good answer. Yeah, there's some interesting dilemmas that occur. If we find, does this work as a general economic policy? Probably not. Somebody's got to feed everyone and have the children and raise them. And it certainly seems historically that while there were groups that took the plunge and tried to live that way, it wasn't for everyone, right? So that's kind of interesting. Holy orders. So there are still groups today that take holy orders. They've been in the press a lot lately, actually, and not for a good reason, because apparently it's rather difficult for young males to live together without other opportunities, I suppose. I don't know how that works. And it's not just Roman Catholics, it's probably universities, gymnasts apparently have difficulty with it.
Well, but like I said when I emailed you back in response to that, the idea of celibacy making you extra holy or closer to God or being a requirement for priesthood does not have biblical founding.
But neither does being the founder of Playboy magazine and having a house full of bunnies. That's not necessarily right.
No.
What was the name of that guy? Anybody know?
Hugh Hefner.
Hugh Hefner. Not a saint. He thinks of Hugh Hefner as a saint. Not even close.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Well, as you pointed out, though, in that, oh man, what was the name of the play where Satan was arguably a protagonist and or a hero of sorts, perhaps an anti-hero?
Well, lots of different things
Oh man, I can't
approach
think of it.
that.
But anyways,
Paradise Lost by Milton.
I think that's the one.
Did I mention that? I don't remember mentioning it.
No, I was doing some other reading or research. But anyways, in the Paradise Lost, Satan is portrayed or widely interpreted in one particular way, but someone made a compelling argument that he was actually the protagonist and a hero of sorts.
He reversed God and Satan, basically. He said that the real God was the one that ended up getting kicked into jail, and the one that was ruling all that time was Satan.
But I don't necessarily agree with that, but it's an interesting, it's like a different spin on things that's of interest.
Milton definitely had a different spin.
So in that sense, Hugh Hefner could be a hero.
I suppose.
You just have to work a little harder.
Look at all the opportunities he gave all those great models.
Yeah, he's
Got them started in show business. Yeah.
Exactly. Made him lots of money.
Yes, he was Trump's hero, actually. Trump modeled himself on Hugh Hefner, and that was the kind of life he wanted to lead. And we voted him into office, which is, it's not my fault. Well, let's not go there. That's kind of interesting. Okay, but the reason I asked the question was to irritate you.
Thanks.
This is obviously a miserable kind of spot to be in. Here you are in a predominantly Christian society, and everyone's probably aware that in the Bible at some point Jesus says, yes, this is sell everything you have, give the money, come follow me. That's how you can be saved. And remember, the rich man is like, oh crap, I don't want to do that, and he leaves. And Jesus famously says, it's harder for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, which, by the way, is a real thing. Apparently, when the city's closed at night, the main gate would close, and the only gate that you could use to get into the city would be the small tower door, which made it look like, if you think of it as kind of like a minaret with a little door at the bottom, it looks like the eye of a needle. And if your camel is late and you have to get in, you can actually do it, but the camel has to crawl through the door, which makes it difficult. So that's kind of weird. Wow, where do you hear stuff like that? So that's interesting. But I wanted to bother you with that question because I think that's what Socrates did to people, was put you in that kind of a dilemma. So remember, I was talking about the Euthyphro, the dialogue where he asks the priest, Euthyphro, what does it mean to be pious? Euthyphro ends up stumbling, apparently, because there's multiple gods, hence the Zeus as a swan compared to Hera, who's in charge of matrimony, so clearly not a marriage maid. Well, it is a marriage made in heaven. But it wasn't a good one, especially, because of the dilemma that they had, different goals. But so Euthyphro ends up having a problem, and Socrates rephrases or changes the definitional question and says, so do the gods love the pious because it's so pious, or is the pious pious because the gods love it? In other words, what becomes the ideal, the good, is that kind of a anthropomorphic individual happens to like it, and that's why we all have to basically kind of adhere to that kind of ideal? Or is the pious so pious that that's why the gods love it? In other words, we ought, as thinking, rational individuals, be able to figure out what is pious, what's the good, which is a Platonic enterprise, to figure out what is the good, what is the good, what is justice, what is love, what is friendship, etc. Yes?
I think in the previous class you mentioned that one of the reasons why this was particularly difficult was because they had polytheism and they had multiple gods of multiple things with differing conflicting values, right? But I don't think that necessarily that confusion or contradiction about what godly values necessarily goes away or gets much better with monotheism, because, for example, looking at the characteristics of God as described in the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's some striking differences there. And then also, for example, concepts, like, hell and eternal damnation and so forth. On the one hand, God is just and God is wise and God is fair and God is love. But on the other hand, even if I sin 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, from the time that I'm born to the time that I die, for 100 years of constant 24/7 sin.
What you're saying is God evolves.
How does infinite torture equate that? That's not justice.
Well, God clearly, over our history, human beings, has evolved. Our conception of God has evolved. The earliest views of it were, by comparison, nowhere close to the sophisticated. And we can see that still going today. The church, for example, when I call it the church, I'm thinking of the Catholic Church, and the others I think of as sects. Sorry, it's the joy of sects.
SECTS.
Yes, there's a book. There's a book called The Joy of Sects. Believe it or not. So when we look at the church, we say, oh, well, the church was violent. Look how the call to the Crusades. Let's go kill all these people. Obviously, lots of issues. It's a human enterprise historically, and so on. But what you could see is that it continues to evolve. Pope Francis right now, who's the newest, if you're familiar, right? He's calling on the church to evolve to a different level, and that's an issue for a lot of the conservatives that don't want it to go that way. So he's being more inclusive and more ambiguous about things that could keep you out of heaven and so on, right? So that's upsetting a lot of the conservatives, and you have to admit, yes, the church has had problems with this and it's problem with this, but it wants to improve, it wants to grow.
Well, along that train of thought, one argument could be that the concepts of God continue to change and evolve as society continues to change and evolve.
Right,
Because to some
exactly.
degree, we make them up.
Everybody agree with it?
So, God is what we
by the way,
say.
it doesn't necessarily mean that we make them up.
But you get my point.
We're not making up atoms. We're not making up
But what we believe to
the
be God
rotation of the
changes.
earth, etc. Right? So, is this as exciting a topic for everyone as it is to Heinz? You all feel like throwing things at me at any point? As long as it's not a knife, I'm okay with that. Yes?
I had a question about the euthypro of Socrates. It seemed like he presented a couple of dichotomous arguments where Socrates is saying, is it this or that? But maybe it's neither. And that's what he was trying to drive at, where true piety is where you can sit as a blindfolded maiden holding the scales and judge the balance of things, good and bad, but being blind to that paradigm of judging, in other words, prejudging something as good or prejudging something as bad. That is essentially achieving a supermoral state rather than an idiomatic moral paradigm.
Well, the Platonic dialogues evolved too. So I hope you don't mind the concept of evolution. But if you think of it, we've got 3 different periods that are traditionally viewed, that the dialogues are in. And that's because Plato is the author of these dialogues. So Socrates is the main character in almost all of them, but nonetheless, he's not the author of them. As far as we know, Socrates did not write anything that we still have. Neither did he write somebody's sins in the sand or anything of that sort. As far as we know, that was Jesus did that, right? But Plato's the author, and it seems like the early dialogues are describing Socrates as the asshole, as the kind of person he really was. It's called a Freudian slip.
Yes.
Get the idea, right? The kind of eloquent annoyance that he was, the horsefly that kept nipping on everybody's butt that he described himself as, right? You know, and the Euthyphro is a perfect example of that. And in fact, the Apology itself, the trial, where he clearly could have defended himself in a way that the crowd expected. He says he deliberately doesn't speak that way because, you know, it's too late. He's too old. There's lots of reasons he gives, right?
Seems very sorry, not sorry. to me.
But he kind of annoys the heck out of people. You know, he puts them on a spot. If I'm impious and I'm corrupting the youth, who is an example of someone who doesn't corrupt them? Oh, the judges here. You know, oh, they're all 500 or however many. You know, every single one of them are perfectly. How about the other people? Yeah, everybody is a pious teacher of children except you. You know, well, that's just dumb. Because it's like training horses. He says, you go to the best horse trainer to get your horse trained. You don't go to Joe Snuffy, who's never even had a horse, right? That's crazy. So they're clearly not thinking very straight. Plus, they're condemning him for not believing in the gods. They're calling him an atheist, and yet they also admit that he says that the gods have told him to ask these kinds of questions, right? So that's pretty dumb. How can you believe in the effects of the gods unless you believe that the gods are there? So basically, these folks have not been very critically coherent in their presentation. And by the way, that probably is because the society wasn't yet. Remember, logic hadn't been invented yet until Aristotle comes along, and he's a student of Plato, right? And by the way, one of the people that Aristotle critiques when he talks about the sophists includes Plato, who's actually making quite a lot of logical errors in the dialogue. So logic is going to evolve too, right? In retrospect, we could go back and we can see that there's a lot of really brilliant things in these dialogues, but there's also a lot of basic errors.
Well, stuff hasn't been worked out yet. I mean,
We'll still figure.
Basic experimentation.
Now, this is early psychology. When we look at it, we think, oh, it's interesting that Plato gives us this psychology, but no one believes that stuff anymore. It doesn't work, right?
Well, physics, philosophy, even basic biology, the oceans, all started to evolve around this point, but they were not working out experimentation.
Well, they couldn't use Latin names on the genus because Latin hadn't been invented yet.
A fair point, but at the same time.
That was a joke. No one laughed. Okay. So the first period, Socrates is basically a miserable guy that asks the questions that no one can answer and just irritates the heck out of everyone. And of course, that's why they want to kill him. At least the traditional view of why they want to kill him is because he's embarrassing everybody in front of the students that they teach and stuff. It's just. But there's other reasons. He talks about Aristophanes, talking about him in the clouds. That was a play where we still have it available, and Socrates is a really bad character in that, where he really does corrupt the youth. He looks like he's a drunk, etc. And Socrates points this out. You've had these views of me for a long time, but talk to the people that actually know me, and none of them say that I'm like that at all. Right? Well, so they kill him.
But he kills himself.
Well,
He drinks the hemlock, and he refuses to leave. because Athens is his home. But then the dialogues shift, and they become things like the Republic, where people are talking to Socrates, and they ask him, what is justice? And basically, Socrates explains what justice is. What a radical shift, because before, Socrates just annoyed the heck out of others by asking them questions that they couldn't answer. Now everyone's asking Socrates questions, and he's giving them the answers. What happened? Well, the idea is that now Plato is not using Socrates as the character to describe the way Socrates really behaved when he talked with people, but he's instead using Socrates as the character to teach Plato's own views of what the answers ought to be. And this is where we get Platonic idealism. And that goes for the longest period of the dialogues. But then we end up with some dialogues that are considered late. And this is where those ideals that Plato espouses in the middle period end up being put under question. And we discover that Plato realizes there's something drastically wrong with a lot of his ideas. And he can't solve them again. Socrates is still the main character, but it leaves you stuck. And by the way, this is also about the time that there's an overlap with Aristotle, who was Plato's student. And then when we read Plato, or rather read Aristotle, it looks like Aristotle is answering those dilemmas that Plato comes up with in the third period. So I think of Aristotle as basically continuing the work of his teacher, although traditionally what we say is Plato gives us the idealist philosophy, and then along comes Aristotle and slams it and says, no, that's all wrong. You know, I love the idealists, but they're wrong, right? And gives you the Aristotelian answers. And these two answers end up being the two pillars that all of Western philosophy basically keeps bouncing back and forth between. You know, we evolve, we get better answers, but it's always seemingly these two fundamental points of view that are playing with one another, right?
Sort of the cynic versus the idealist.
The cynic I would put under Aristotle and Socrates too. I actually kind of mapped them out so that if you think of Socrates,
Somewhere in there with the realist.
and you of course got Plato, somewhere we also get Aristotle, and then if we have the cynic, what's cynic? It doesn't look. But in any case, notice draw the line directly down to the cynic. But these would be listed as post-Aristotelian cynics, Stoics, Epicureans, skeptics. There's a whole set of the kind of, they're logically placed. We can look at them as an interesting result. Plato, of course, is going to leave us with idealism. And once interpreted by Augustus, we end up with Christianity, basically, there. So that's intriguing. But so I was comparing the situation in a conservative environment, Christian environment for the most part, Alaska, where you're faced with Jesus coming to your door, and on the other hand, you being a typical American consumer, probably Protestant for the most part, where we don't really think of our requirement to basically sell everything and follow Jesus. Instead, we think of ourselves as if we're good Christians, God will give us lots of wealth as our reward for being good Christians. Is that right?
No.
I'd like to know which testament you're reading.
I'm thinking mostly of Weber, however you.
Could I please get you to put the blinds down? It's like bouncing off that table and like totally
Yeah, the glare.
This is a famous book. Notice I specified Protestant, because Protestant is mostly Northern European. If you look at economic history, you'll see that Protestant Europeans, Northern Europeans, developed capitalism and, by the way, the democracy, and basically spread that. And of course, they're the first groups that really established themselves in the new colonies, right? And so our tradition is primarily Protestant capitalist democracy, not a democratic party, right? But if you think of that, and we make more money than anybody, this country, right? So capitalism in that sense is historically associated with Protestantism, not Catholicism. If you look at where Catholicism spread, it's mostly like South America, Central America. Notice those are still third world, or what's the word we use today? Developing countries, right? And the problem is cultural. They're not into entrepreneurial kinds of lives. They listen to what the church says as opposed to fight it and vote, etc. So traditionally, we see wealth building. The modern world is associated with the Protestant Christian religion. You might even want to argue that in order to become modern capitalistic, you have to, number one, be Christian and Protestant as part of the picture, which makes it really difficult if you're Islamic. Because number one, you're not Christian. Number two, you're not Protestant, etc. That's just fun. There's all kinds of interesting things associated with that.
Sorry, if you're I'm wondering, this is German, right? So I'm kind of wondering if this leads into another year, so to speak, because familiarize myself a little bit with the German Catholic cinema, and there's some interesting philosophy going on there.
Yeah, it doesn't really change though. You could look at the way the world economically breaks out, and where Protestantism grows in South America, you see some improvement in enterprise capitalism and so on. It keeps getting stuck though.
But capitalism itself as an economic model doesn't care about your religion. I mean, it's not like, oh, well, you're not the right religion, so you can't, own a business or you can't be successful.
No, but if someone gives themselves to a certain religious philosophy, they don't necessarily tend to stick to that. And in the case of something like
Even when you no longer believe it,
Right.
air quotes,
Right. Right. I mean, I myself.
it's still embedded in your neural network, so that you still think that way.
Right. I mean, I'm speaking as a former churchgoer myself. I recognize that a lot of my life is still fairly Christian Protestant model of some kind or another. So I mean, even now, my faith is far less than it was. So.
I think even in the 60s, when a lot of my contemporaries started getting interested in Asian religions, I think mostly to irritate the heck out of their parents.
There's still a little bit of basis.
But what they were looking for was not Asian religion, but instead an American interpretation of those Asian religions. So, Buddhism itself, for example, is very pessimistic. Seems to be a perfect fit in India and other other places where the population is so densely packed that no one has much of a future. And you might grow up feeling that life just sucks no matter what you do, and the only thing you could possibly hope for is escape from life in some way. And so the Buddhist conception of nirvana is not like a heaven, but instead is the absence of being, where you finally escape reincarnation and constant suffering. It's kind of fun.
Well, one of the things I find interesting, especially in modern days, the current state of Russian society, where it's no longer the Soviet Union, but honestly, so much of it still is. It still has a very strong fatalist attitude, very strong work sort of labor relations issues all over the map. It's a bizarre setup right now.
Well, when you've had over 70 years of communism destroying your nation and crushing your national psyche, yeah, you don't just snap out of that right away.
Well, that's another thing I find interesting in the Soviet Union is I have trouble calling it communist personally because I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. It's
On that note, let me move to Susan Wolf. So, the link I give you here is a performance that Susan Wolf was invited to give at Princeton for the opening of the class in 2016, 2017. There she is. But the text, how many of you had a chance to read the text? Pretty interesting. What did you think? Was she critical of the meaning of life? How would you phrase the question? How would you start a discussion about her article? What did you feel while you were? Does your life have any meaning? Yes.
Like she was getting out of purpose to like how if you feel like you have purpose, then you have meaning. But then she was also talking about how some people might not feel like they need meaning in life, but still live their lives. But those who do need meaning think that the others should feel the same way that they tell them, well, you're just wasting your life. Where's your meaning? So it's kind of like a
Thinking of teaching philosophy. You're good already. We need more philosophy professors. Wow. Just that. Right on the spot. You just did that. That's great.
I actually wasn't able to hear.
Ah, well, that's because you're over there.
Well, also I'm part deaf.
Huh? Oh, I'm sorry. That's wrong. I should not. Sorry about that, hon.
No, it's okay. The Army calls it asymmetric hearing loss.
Yeah, his explanation is right on, and that is that we do have meaning, but it's, well, let me, I'm gonna do it. I need a better magic marker. I don't have one. Shoot. I'll get one later, I guess. But you can see the green. If I use green, you can see it. So last week I was talking about I need a narrative, a meta-narrative. Yes?
Mm-hmm.
I talked about that, right? And so I draw the meta-narrative as if, okay, so it's a big story. Meta just is Greek for beyond. So a narrative is a story, and a meta-narrative is a narrative that explains all the narratives. So ethics, for example, normative ethics is thou shalt not kill. That's a rule. But when you get into meta-ethics, you're talking about why would that rule be good, right? So you're talking about what rules should be set up. Are there different groups of rules that are better than others, right? And you can get into a meta. So we just kind of what we do as human beings. Noam Chomsky says this, that we tend to use recursion. So for example, I just quoted Noam Chomsky and said that he says we use recursion. That's an example of recursion. I quoted myself quoting him. And you can quote me on, and then that's right? So, as a result, we can make sentences that are infinitely long.
That's kind of how most AP press stories work.
Yeah, well, you get the hang of recursion and you're in. You don't have to go to Harvard or Yale. You're in. That's all you need to do is use recursion. Right forever. Right. Math works that way, so it's a human trait. It's interesting, Noam Chomsky doesn't think other animals have it. And he thinks that that's the reason why we're different than, say, like dogs.
Which is one of the things we found out about other primates, that some of them do.
So, well, just before I left, I was putting on my shoes, these things, right? Because it's a good idea, being a human being, I put on shoes. My dog, however, who's still just a puppy, she's going to be 8 months on the 12th, and she's always fascinated when I'm putting on my shoes. So I'm sitting there trying to put my sock on, and she's just watching the whole process. Sometimes she tries to eat my feet while I'm doing it, which is annoying. She's like 90 pounds already. It's like a 90-pound toddler. It's the trouble with St. Bernards. They're really cute when you first get them, and then they get this big, and they're still gnawing on you. And that's not really as pleasant, because now the mouth, your whole elbow is in the mouth. Discovered she could actually eat my knee. However, I'm putting on my shoes, and I'm explaining to her. I understand that you don't get it. That you have perfectly good paws. You don't have to wear shoes, but you'll notice all of us humans we're putting on shoes. I'm thinking, does she understand the conversation? Will she eventually get used to the idea that I'm putting on my shoes and not be interested, just sit there? And is recursion part of my thinking and not hers in that sense? So is there that kind of difference that she can't use recursion and say, oh yes, we've done this before, he's doing it again, and it's the same as, is that part of the recursion issue? Well, it seems like she can do that. I expect her to eventually get used to me putting on my shoes so that she's not going to be as fascinated with that. That's hopefully maturation of the dog. But still, I wonder if recursion is part of that. That's Noam Chomsky, the question of recursion. Talks about recursion grammars. By the way, if you look up recursion on Google, it's hilarious. It comes up and says, did you mean recursion? You got it. It's a joke, right? Yeah. What's recursion? Did you mean recursion? Yes. Did you mean recursion? Yes. Did you mean recursion?
Repeat and repeat, we're sitting on a log.
How long are you going? How long before you get it?
There's a programmer in the Google
he was having
stacks
fun
having a
with
little
this.
too much.
Or she. Could be a she. So that's just. No, yeah. Okay, so put this into the context of a meta-narrative. We can create stories, explaining stories, etc. So we, talking about, I think you mentioned the Odyssey was your favorite story. Who was that? Was that this class? Wasn't it? Did you say the Odyssey was your favorite story?
No.
It wasn't
Somebody
this
did,
one.
I remember somebody saying that last week.
But you know, when I think of the Odyssey, I think of all the other things I've read about the Odyssey. You know, there's the origin of stories, which that's it's kind of odd. The two stories that he talks about as his examples are Horton Hears a Who and the Odyssey.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, that's quite.
Horton Hears a Who, that's Dr. Seuss, man.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I
That's awesome.
assumed you would know that.
Well, that's about my level, yeah.
And the one time I asked the class, you know, well, all of you, we were reading it was in Logic, we were talking about Hamlet is a tragedy and Kung Fu Panda is a comedy. And I wanted to break the class up a little bit, so I said to everyone, so, you know, is Hamlet really a tragedy? And everyone just sat there. I said, how many of you have read Hamlet? No one volunteered to say that they had read Hamlet.
Last 4 years.
But everyone knew Kung Fu Panda. Everyone. So it's just kind of our culture is evolving.
Devolving is a type of evolving,
Well,
just like
that's- I
braking is a
wouldn't-
type of acceleration.
Like Lenin always used to say, "Shag vperyod, dva shaga nazad." It's one step forward, 2 steps back.
The Russian.
Was it Lenin or Stalin that said that we would not, ideas are more powerful than bullets. We would not let our enemies have bullets, therefore we should not let our enemies have ideas. That was either Stalin or Lenin, I forget which one.
Sounds more like Stalin, but I
Sounds
don't
like
remember.
one to me.
In any case,
Not sure I'm going to them for advice.
anyway, when I veer off topic, I'm really staying on topic, just so you know.
Recursively.
It's recursive. So, we could play with the Odyssey and talk about it and its characteristics, how it plays on the relationship that Odysseus has with women. There's 3 women. Penelope, by the way, Pene, Lope means to weave and then to unweave. Anybody remember what she does? The whole story? Penelope, right? What does she do? Nobody. She's weaving a tapestry, right? And the suitors are all expecting that as soon as she finishes the tapestry, and then she will pick which one of them will get to replace her husband, because their assumption is that he's dead, right? But at night, she spends the evening unweaving what she weaved during the day. So, Pene Lope, right? So
Title more.
again, yes, I love how that works. But so we have the idea that a meta-narrative is the big picture, the big story that gives you your meaning in life. Because that's where I get my roles. Remember, I drew lots of smaller stories, that can be, and they could be overlapping stories, right? So if I'm a citizen, father, teacher, soldier, patient, shopper at Cars, right? If I have a story that explains how that shopping experience works, right? And for me, it's I deliver my daughter there, and I sit in the car and read until she comes out again. So that's how I shop. Because I hate shopping. If I'm absolutely required to be the person to go in, and I'll just go to I'm supposed to get one of these, and one of these. And I'm gone. I have no interest whatsoever in staying in the store longer. If I'm there with my daughter and it's a cold day out, instead of sitting in the car, I go in, and I'm the ugly, weird guy that just stares at people while you've seen that on Facebook, because I'm just kind of, I'm not shopping, I'm not pushing a cart, but I have to stand here and wait until she's ready to check out. So I'm the weird person. So I have a story that's just for that. And by the way, there's vocabulary embedded in that. So for example, there's vocabulary that you use shopping in Freddy's that you don't use anywhere else. Grocery cart. You have a grocery cart except at grocery stores, right? You have checkout counters. Well, you have checkout counters in other stores too, but they're clearly, rather different, right? Yeah, so think of it. There's lots of vocabulary. Sale items, right? Are these oranges on sale? Yes. What about these peaches? They're not on sale? No, they're not. You mean I can't buy them? No, of course you can buy them. They're just not on sale.
They're for sale, not on sale.
They're for. Yeah, you don't get anything off the regular price, etc. Right?
And if you go over here, you get the everyday low price.
Yeah, so there's all kinds of vocabulary, and you become a fluent speaker of shopping, so that you know how to do that sort of thing, right? So you've got shopping, you've got marriage, but as I mentioned, I think last week, my daughter comes and says, "Dad, I need $1,000 to fix my car," and my wife says, "Don't you dare give her that money, because you'll never be able to teach her how to be self-sufficient if you keep giving her money." And that's because my wife reads magazines that says, "Don't give your daughter money. You need it for your investments, which we want you to give us." Or what, how they do that, right? So I'm in conflict over whether or not I'm supposed to give my daughter money or obey my wife, who's deathly afraid she's someday going to end up as a bag lady, right, without any money. And so I look at maybe my meta-narrative to resolve the conflict, and of course I give my daughter money. I might give her $9.95. So I didn't give her the whole amount, something of that sort, right? But what sort of thing is my meta-narrative? She says you can't have such a thing unless you have a God. And then she goes on to say, and God doesn't exist, by the way. No one agrees that God exists. And in fact, she points out that Thomas Nagel, who was her thesis supervisor, and the second part of tonight, right, thought not only does God not exist, but if God did exist, who's to say God would give a crap about what we do?
Are you familiar with the deist model?
Yes, that's it. Right. And also Epicurus. There's some ancient Greek folks that say the gods exist, but it's just dumb thinking that they care about us at all. Hindu gods, if you think of them, they're mostly divinities that rule over specific aspects of life,
Mhm.
and what you want to know about them, I'm not a Hindu, but my understanding is that what you worship them for is for their advice on how to handle different situations,
To grant you wisdom in that area of
to
expertise.
avoid being stepped on by them, for example.
Well, if I understand correctly, it's interesting to note that some of the founding fathers followed the deist model.
Jefferson is famous for that, yes. He wrote his own Bible, version of the Bible, pruned it of all the things he thought were incorrectly included. Right, yes? You
I
can see
believe
a
so.
copy
I
of
think
it. They have
isn't
it.
that, isn't he the same one who also had a copy of the Quran as well?
Yes, he did.
Yes. But that was only because we were involved in war with the Barbary pirates at the time.
I don't know why he had it, but he did have it. And you can see his collection, at least things like his Bible in the University of Virginia Library
Mm.
on the mall there. Big thing, which, by the way, underneath has a really fascinating library of constitutions that have been written, and the declarations, for example, of independence of all sorts of folks, not just the one that he penned,
Mhm.
etc. It's a neat building if you ever get the chance to go see it. And Edgar Allan Poe had a cell in the mall. If you go around the other side, there's a glass door that you could look in and you could see the raven sitting on the window ledge, and it says above, a small cell for a large poet. Okay. And he only stayed there one semester, but they were still proud. Still, she says God is absolutely essential, and I think that's right.
Well, I've also heard it said that if God didn't exist, we would create him to fill that need for ourselves.
But remember, we're doing what God desires. So if we create God, we're doing it exactly the way God wants us to do that.
Well, unless you.
Just throwing that out there.
Well, I
You know,
get
that's
your point, but
that's because I like Hegel, and that's the way Hegel would express that. So that the reason that God is evolving conceptually is because God is evolving.
well, you could also still
So
discuss though,
the
gap
two of them go
between-
together, actually.
Yeah, idealized self versus the actualized self. So like maybe my idea of God isn't how I am or how I act, but how I wish I was or how I wish I could act.
For Hegel, the real is the truth is the real, and the real is the truth. The whole is the real. It's
Is that a realism stage?
rational. We could call it that.
Maybe all
In
of
other
this
words, what are actually, if for Hegel, everything that's evolving is the way the world was meant to be, right? And so, it's both rational and what really is. So of course, you end up with this equation that the real is the rational and the rational is the real, or the truth is the whole. So it's the whole thing, which, by the way, means that whenever we describe things in language, that's not going to be it, because our language automatically frames things in a particular model, linguistic model, which is, so again, I could say this is a cup, that's true, but guess what? There's way more characteristics associated with this than just what I can use to describe it in English, right? I can't possibly describe all of the characteristics of this because I'm limited to English, to French, to languages, things of that sort.
would that be any different with a language such as Chinese that uses ideograms where, like for us, a
No.
word is a part of a sentence,
If
but
it's-
for them, a character is a whole sentence?
Right, but if it's in a cognitive symbolic system used by human beings in order to think about something, we're abstracting from the way this is Hegel's language, we're abstracting from the way things are. Because the way things are all the ways that they are, not just the way we describe them. So there's a limitation, we can't, in a sense, know the whole. Right? Well, we don't want to get stuck on Hegel, not at this point. You look puzzled.
No, I'm just, I think we're confused.
But so when I say that I think she's right, that you need God, you need to believe in God, and so all those philosophers that say God doesn't exist, I don't know which ones she's talking about. An awful lot of the ones I read believe God does exist. In fact, I think I mentioned the ontological argument last class, momentarily, right?
Yeah.
Right? God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. Did I mention that? No? We'll do this when we do Anselm.
Well, maybe all this confusion about God and religion is why Mao Zedong said that religion is the opium of the people.
So, I'll actually go into the article here. So one, this Troslogion, Anselm claims to derive the existence of God from the concept of a being than which no greater can be conceived. And that's basically an art. So, ontos is a thing, or a definition of a thing. Logical is the argument, or the order, or whatever. So an ontological argument is an argument based on the definition of the thing. And for God, we have traditionally ontological arguments, we have cosmological arguments, and we have teleological arguments. Teleological argument from design, right? Cosmological argument from cause, right? We look at the cosmos, right? But ontological is just the definition of God. By definition, and this is around 1100, Anselm defines God as that than which nothing greater can be thought or conceived. And when you read contemporary theologians, that's the definition they still carry with them. Aquinas will use it, for example, in the Summa. Remember, I think I mentioned that Aquinas is strictly the Orthodox theology still today. So that's the definition I'm using, and the wonderful thing about it is it doesn't describe any other characteristics. The bad thing about it is it doesn't describe any other characteristics. So the neat thing is it demonstrates that God must exist, but we don't know anything about God. So it's annoying as heck, you know. Annoys the heck out of people, especially if you've grown up and you've been taught that the only, you can't prove that God exists, all you can do is have faith that God exists. And then you come along and you have this ancient proof that God exists, and you're like, no, that's no good. But sorry, it seems to work. It's a mathematical sort of thing.
It works and it doesn't work, and it's very, very open to
Yes,
interpretation.
look up ontological argument, and you've got your whole future set up for you.
Isn't it kind of like wrong in a sense, just because it claims that or it assumes that existence is better than non-existence, or is greater than?
Yes.
Which isn't necessarily this.
Well, unless what you're thinking is that non-existence, you could have a God that's not existent.
Yeah, but it says that a God that exists would be better, but that's assumes.
Yeah,
that
yeah,
existence is
you know,
better.
if you know.
I think, right?
I think Kant gives a great example when he talks about money. You know, here's a kopeck. Actually, actually. I think he talks about some other kind of, a shilling or I don't know. Here you go. Well, wait a minute. I'd rather have a real one because that's better. Yeah. I'd rather have real money. I'll give you some money. Here you go. No thanks. I'd rather have real money. What would you rather have? A real $10 or $1?
Yeah, but that doesn't necessarily.
No, I said that wrong. A real $1 or a fake $10? No, you don't want the fake $10. It's useless. The real $1 is better. So basically, God gets to be better if God exists.
But that doesn't necessarily prove he's real, right? Because it goes on itself to essentially.
Well,
It's kind of, I think, part of the point of ambiguity, though, is that we're dealing with
and it's annoying. All right, what I suspect is that there's an annoyance there. When you say this works, it proves that the concept God has a referent that exists. Otherwise, the definition is in contradiction with itself, which is why it is a proof, because you can't have a contradiction. So God must be that than which nothing greater can be thought.
And then on the flip
Snazzy.
side-
But then what is it, right? So that's absolutely annoying to everyone because, when you have folks like Stephen Hawking say things that, when we figure out the grand unified theory that explains everything, we'll know the mind of God. What the heck is he talking about? Stephen Hawking. We can't ask him now, he's dead. But so I don't know where she's obviously coming from the point of view that this proof doesn't work. It seems to me that it does. I think I mentioned Paul Tillich and the concept of the ultimate concern. Which fits Heitz's point that we created. Or not. I mean, if we didn't have a God, we would make one. If we were horses, our God would look like horses. If we were zebras, it would probably have a horse with a zebra.
Or rams.
I don't know who I'm quoting, but you've probably heard that same argument, right? Of course, we're much more sophisticated today. So when we think in terms of contemporary scientists, and we think about the force that created the universe, it's outside of the universe. It can't be